Here are the saddest ways people got scammed. Number 4. Brits versus Aussies. An unknown Englishman, or perhaps a team of Englishmen, scammed at least 4 families and an accountant out of their hard-earned money. He went by many names, including Ben Davis, David Jones, and Oliver James. The leader of the team, who we'll refer to as Mr. English, called several victims after they found his website and roped them into his scheme. A man named Andy from Melbourne, Australia, felt confident when he saw his $150,000 investment show up in his account on the fraudulent website. A few weeks passed, and he wired another $550,000 to the website to purchase Swedish treasury bills. He recommended the website to his sister, whose bank flagged it as a scam before she could send any money. Even then, Andy was still convinced the site was legitimate until his dividends took a little too long to appear in his bank account. When he called his bank, they said it was too late to do anything. His money was gone. Corey and Jody Bridges, a married couple who worked hard for 15 years to build a nest egg for their children, lost $500,000 to the scammers. After doing their due diligence and checking the company's background, the pair was convinced it was legit and made 4 payments of $250,000. 2 were returned, 2 were not. Miss Bridges called the scam gut-wrenching, and she will never forgive herself for the money she lost. An accountant lost $160,000, claiming he asked the scammers technical questions and liked their responses. He also felt confident when the scammers informed him they would be closed on a federal holiday. After losing his money, he said he was embarrassed and the scam made him sick. This wasn't Mr. English's first jog around the block. In 2020, an elderly couple lost their $200,000 savings to a similar scam based around a fraudulent Barclays Bank website. Their contact was none other than Mr. English. Now they're penniless and have no choice but to live off of their pension money. To prevent something like this from happening to you, here are a few investment red flags to look out for. 1. A supposed financial advisor promises low risks and high returns. 2. Someone you don't know contacts you out of the blue to give you unsolicited investment advice. 3. A person pressures you, calling you repeatedly and telling you you'll miss out if you don't invest soon. 4. The person or website claims to be endorsed by celebrities. This is usually false, as most celebrities don't share their investments with the public. 5. You are asked to deposit funds into different accounts for each transaction. They may say it's for security reasons or because they're an international company. The truth is, they're probably scammers. Australians have already lost $158 million to scams just halfway through 2022. $80 million of that was lost to scams involving mobile app. If you suspect a possible scam, contact your bank immediately. Don't confront the scammers or give any indication you're onto them. Number 3. Desperately lonely. Sunita Britton, a teaching assistant from Doncaster, UK, was swindled out of £9,000 or roughly $11,000 US in a scheme similar to the Tinder swindler. Sunita lost her job and her entire life savings because of a man named Michael Anderson. Whether that's his real name or not remains a mystery. A mother of 2, Sunita was going through a divorce when she met Michael, officially ending what she saw as a loveless marriage. She was desperate to feel wanted again and thought he could solve that. 2 met on Facebook dating in January of 2022. Michael claimed to be the owner of a multi-million-pound global engineering company and a cryptocurrency analyst with many offshore accounts. The 2 quickly left Facebook, opting to talk on WhatsApp instead. In the beginning, Anderson sent Sunita several pictures of himself, all which looked heavily filtered. Some didn't even look like him. One of the biggest red flags Sunita admitted was the fact that Michael never agreed to talk on FaceTime, claiming he was camera shy. The one time Sunita made an attempt, she saw a blurry side profile of a man who looked twice Michael's age. Everything else about Michael seemed too good to be true. He told Sunita he was adopted as a child just like her, and they shared the same birthday. Michael was always the one to initiate what Sunita called heavy conversations, telling her everything she wanted to hear and constructing a personal fairy tale. But this fairy tale didn't have a happy ending. On January 17, 2022, Michael put his plan into action. He told Sunita that he had to leave immediately for Cyprus, an island off the coast of Syria, to give £160,000 to a family in need following what he called a terrible accident. As soon as he arrived, things took a turn for the worse. Michael told Sunita he had been detained by the Cyprus police and that he needed her to make transfers from his bank account to his lawyer for him. All 3 of these payments were declined, and Sunita received an email from Michael's so-called bank informing her that Michael's account had been put on hold for security reasons. That's when Michael got desperate. He pleaded with Sunita to bail him out, staying on the phone with her so long that she ended up losing her teaching job due to excessive phone use during work hours. Eventually, Sunita was convinced, so she transferred her £9,000 life savings to an account held by David Ganna, Michael's supposed lawyer. Once the transfer was complete, it seemed all was well. Michael sent Sunita screenshots of his plane tickets back to Doncaster, where the two would meet and take a plane together to Los Angeles. There, they would unfreeze his bank account and have some quality time together at last. Unfortunately, Sunita received a call from Michael's lawyer telling her that Michael had once again been detained by police on his way back home, this time for tax evasion. Frustrated, Sunita called her friend and explained the situation. Immediately, her friend knew it was a scam and told her so. When Sunita realized her friend was right, she called her bank and told them to freeze her account. That should have been the end of it. But Michael began calling her from different phone numbers, yelling at her to unfreeze her bank account and threatening to find out where she lived. On February 1st, 2022, Sunita saw a suspicious-looking van outside her house, called the police. Sunita still resides in her home, hoping her tale of losing her job and life savings and possibly putting her kids in danger prevents the same thing from happening to anyone else. Number 2. The Royal Scam. Baroness Jacqueline von Zulen, a member of the UK's upper class, lost her £2 million fortune when she trusted the wrong investment broker. The broker, Rodney Whiston-Dew, refused to return the Baroness's money, claiming he invested it properly and that whatever's left of her fortune was safe in a Caribbean trust fund. He claims he was obligated to use her investment money to pay for her ever-increasing expenses, including travel, clothing, food, vehicle, and furniture costs. He also claims the Baroness had a mountain of credit card debt, which he was left to deal with as she gave him power of attorney over her money. The Baroness inherited her money from her marriage with Baron Thierry von Zulen, who died in 2011. The two split up before his death, and the Baroness received a hefty £2 million divorce settlement. The Baroness never worked a day in her life, making the loss of her fortune more difficult. Now she's stressed out, unable to pay her rent or keep up her lavish lifestyle. She's had to beg, steal, and borrow just to stay alive. Meanwhile, Dew went to jail for 10 years in 2017 for a £108 million tax scam involving 5 other accomplices. The men promised tax breaks to 730 wealthy people, promising to invest their money in environmental causes in Brazil and China. As it turned out, they were peddling money between their own offshore accounts and businesses to secure their own tax breaks. While Whiston-Dew wasn't the leader of this group, he played a vital role in setting up the offshore business and roping clients into the scam. Whiston-Dew declined to attend his trial in person, citing depression and anxiety as reasons. While sitting in his cell, he tried declaring bankruptcy to avoid the case. When that didn't work, he attempted to get the case thrown out, saying that UK courts have no jurisdiction over the island of Nevis, where he invested the Baroness's money. He claims returning the trust fund money to the Baroness would be a breach of trust and violate Nevis's laws. The judge threw out this line of reasoning, saying that he violated the UK's Financial Conduct Authority rules and, therefore, the case could be heard on British soil, a major win for the Baroness. We'll have to see how the future unravels and if the Baroness ever gets her money back. We all know she's not going back to work. Number 1. The Mom Scam. A son kidnapped by mysterious men, a £10,000 ransom, and a threat to take off one finger every 15 minutes until they got the money. His worried mother called the cops to tell them what happened, but everything wasn't as it seemed. Rainer Earnshaw sent his mom several frantic texts 4:55 to 10:55 a.m. one Tuesday morning. He sent his mom pictures of himself with 2 knife wounds on his chest. Every few minutes he texted her saying he would die if she didn't send the ransom money. Then he'd criticize her for not sending it, saying his blood was on her hand. When his mom called the police, she was in for a big surprise. After hours of searching, they were finally able to track down Rainer. Except he didn't have wounds and wasn't missing any fingers. He was sitting in a cafe, calmly sipping a cup of tea. Turns out, Rainer made the whole thing up as a way to con his mother out of £10,000. The police arrested Rainer and 3 others who they believed aided his conspiracy. He was charged with giving false information resulting in a police investigation, using a carriage service to menace and stalking. While his friends were let free, he was denied bail. Who's someone you'd think would never scam anyone? Would it be Philip Ryle, an Amish ice cream store owner? Or would it be Paul Rinfret, a seemingly trustworthy fund manager? Let's get right to it. Number 4. Wall Street Ponzi. After starting his investment fund, Plandome Partners LLC, Paul Rinfret boasted about how his investment strategy earned them triple-digit returns. Each month since 2012, they claimed that they had consistently made more money. Paul Rinfret was a man with a luxurious palate, spending over $19 million on cigars, alcohol, cars, house renovations, you name it, and he bought it. He used the money to buy his dry cleaning, gas, and other daily expenses. Paul even spent $30,000 on a venue called the Water Club in Manhattan so his son could host a red carpet-themed engagement party. Of course, we all want to give our families the best. And how else do we do that if not with money? The issue was that Paul did all this without spending a dime of his own money. On September 29th, 2020, Paul was sentenced to 5 years in prison for running a $19 million Ponzi scheme from 2016 to 2019. For returning viewers, you already know this, but for new viewers, a Ponzi scheme is when you pay current investors with the money used by new investors. It's similar to a pyramid scheme, except there's no recruiting under the pretenses of selling things to make money. Paul promised investors that if they put their money into Plandome Partners, he would invest their money to trade futures contracts tied to S&P 500. He claimed that he had created a foolproof trading algorithm and would only take 25% of net profits. In reality, he only used a small portion of their money and the rest to fund his luxury lifestyle. On top of that, the little money he actually did put to trading, he would often end up losing money. He would create fake statements that looked like his clients were making big bucks to stop them from pulling out. Overall, he scammed 6 investors out of their money. If that wasn't bad enough, he also opened accounts with a brokerage firm using the names of his family members, one being his son, John, who Paul had paid for his engagement party. Another was a family member who had passed away in 2014, and Paul had continued pretending to be this family member until 2016, long after they had passed. Paul's family claimed they were unaware of the fraud committed under their names. Instead, they thought of him as a brilliant investor. They lived in the lap of luxury, having the ability to spend $50,000 on a Hamptons vacation rental and over $400,000 on restaurants, jewelry, and shoes. He used his investors' money to pay for tanning services, student loans, car washes, and other personal expenses as well. Paul also transferred $845,000 to 2 companies controlled by his wife Denise, one of them being the Rinfret Group, an interior design company co-run by their daughter Missy. Denise and Missy had to write a statement claiming they had no idea that Paul had earned money fraudulently. Along with this, Paul sent $325,000 to his son John and $675,000 to his son-in-law. His family claimed they were under the impression that he had legitimately earned all of this money. Paul Rinfret is still in jail, having served 2 out of the 5-year sentence he received. After his prison time, he'll still have 2 more years of supervised release. He had to forfeit over $20 million and pay over $12 million in restitution for his targets. His home sits, overtaken by vines, foreclosed after his arrest. Having once had a loving family, his now ex-wife Denise and their children no longer speak to him. After living at the top for many years, Paul Rinfret is a perfect example of the higher you sit, the harder you fall. Number 3. Scamming exec. Now let's take a trip down to Sydney, Australia, where we can find 2 women under trial for a $40 million scam connected to NAB, the Australian National Bank. An unknown whistleblower sent executives at the bank an outline claiming that Rosemary Rogers had been receiving money from the chief executive of an events company named Human Group, Helen Rosamond, for years. Rosemary, former chief of staff at NAB, turned herself into the police after suspicion of the scam. During the investigation, Rosemary struck a deal to decrease her sentence by providing information proving that Helen was involved. What a way to break up a friendship, but what they discovered since then is crucial. Allegedly, Helen offered gifts and money, intending to leave the bill to be paid by the bank. Helen made invoices to look like NAB expenses, and Rosemary ensured that the bank staff paid all the fraudulent invoices. Helen was known by all her friends to be quite generous. One of her more considerable expenses included a $620,000 trip where she took family and friends to America and had them travel by yachts and private jets. Helen bought Rosemary a luxury car and a boat. She also spent over $30,000 on a fuel tab, a friend's 70th birthday bash, and a $132,000 trip to the Rocky Mountains. The largest bill was $2.2 million, so Rosemary could buy a house and send $700,000 into Helen's pocket. They marked it as an expense for Project Eagle, the code name for the onboarding event of Mike Baird as a NAB executive in 2017. Prosecutors think Human Group had nothing to do with the Project Eagle event. While Rosemary pleaded guilty to accepting bribes, 47-year-old Helen Rosamond pleaded not guilty to 60 counts of bank fraud and 32 counts of attempting to obtain an advantage by deception. Rosemary has since been on trial and sentenced to 8 years in prison. Helen's trial, on the other hand, was set for 2021. In August, her counsel applied to extend the date, stating that she could afford a legal team because the National Australian Bank had frozen all of her assets. This application was approved, and her trial date was set for early 2022. As of the upload of this video, the trial has yet to take place, but Helen's lawyer has stated that he plans to prove that Rosemary had taken all the benefits for herself. Number 2. Amish scamming. When you think of the ice cream man, what comes to mind? A man in an ice cream truck ready to pull out whichever ice cream you want. Or maybe a smiling guy behind a counter scooping whatever flavor you ask. Does it involve scamming families who go to your church out of millions of dollars? Philip Elvin Reel, the 68-year-old owner of Trickling Springs Creamery, scammed hundreds of Amish and Mennonite investors out of $60 million over 10 years. In what was known as the largest Ponzi scheme in Pennsylvania, Philip used the fact that he and his targets were part of the same religion to build trust with his investors. This is commonly known as affinity fraud, an investment scam that preys on members of similar identifying groups such as religion or ethnic groups. It's safe to say that people tend to trust those who worship at the same church. Those communities tend to build a group willing to help one another, but Philip wasn't interested in anyone but himself. He had lured investors to a fund that made out loans to Trickling Springs Creamery, Philip's dairy farm. Here, they sold milk, cheese, yogurt, and ice cream. Philip led investors under the pretenses that Trickling Springs was profitable, and in reality, the creamery was on its way downhill. Philip had used new investors' money to pay off old investors, and by December 2019, they had lost $59.7 million. Talk about milking his friends out of their money. In February of 2020, Philip pleaded guilty to conspiracy and fraud charges having to do with the Ponzi scheme. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison with 3 years of supervised release. Along with the jail time, the judge ordered him to pay a little less than $60 million in restitution, and he also had to forfeit $59 million along with the 2 real estate properties. It shows that you always have more to lose when you commit fraud. Trickling Springs Creamery filed for bankruptcy in September 2019 and shut its doors later that December. Just 9 months later, the owners of South Mountain Creamery, a dairy farm in Maryland, announced that they had acquired Trickling Springs, revamping their decor and merchandise by adding a new artisanal products like freshly baked bread and local honey. It's good to see that the creamery still has the potential to thrive in new hands. Number 1. Vulnerable vets. 68-year-old Scott Cohn was living large in his California mansion, knowing that he had been scamming thousands of veterans into high-interest loans. Scott and his 3 co-conspirators created a corporation called Future Income Payments LLC, which promised investors up to 8% profit on their investments. During this time, the scam artists were reaching out to veterans in financial distress and offering lump sums in exchange for the rights to their monthly pensions. Unbeknownst to their targets, their contracts would end with tons of hidden fees and up to 240% interest on their loans. This led to the $300 million Ponzi scheme and the financial ruin of roughly 13,000 people. Scott was getting into trouble for years before the giant Ponzi scheme. In 1988, he opened 47 businesses that have since shut their doors. Then, in 2006, he was charged with 3 felonies for selling counterfeit computer parts. Scott pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 15 months in prison. Shortly after was when he started his biggest scam. He started started Future Income Payments LLC and 20 other companies to run his complex Ponzi scheme. Scott had ordered that they use late-night advertising and the internet to reach more people. He even had one of his co-conspirators host a 90-minute seminar called Social Security Facts 101. During this seminar, he convinced investors to allow Black Harbor Wealth Management, one of Scott's businesses, to be their financial advisor. He claimed that he had heard all the horror stories and promised this wouldn't be one. Unfortunately, he forgot to mention the 60 clients in South Carolina that his company had already become a horror story to. Black Harbor played a significant role in this scheme by being the primary way of gaining investors. Once investors put their money in the hands of Black Harbor, Scott would use it to give out loans to struggling veterans coming to future income payments. One alleged target was a veteran trying to pay for his wife's cancer treatment. He originally went to Scott for a $5,000 loan, not knowing that soon he would end up charging 50% of hidden fees and 240% interest on that loan. Another target was a school librarian named Mary Oram. She invested over $50,000 of her money she saved over 25 years working in a high school. When the time came, she was promised a 6 to 8% annual profit and hoped it would keep her out of a nursing home. Now, she's lost all but $6,000, one of the thousands who had lost money. Meanwhile, Scott lived a lavish lifestyle in an exclusive gated community, a $4.8 million mansion overlooking the Pacific Ocean just south of LA. He spent a lot of his money on the house and paid for the pool maintenance, furniture, and carpets, HOA fees, and a custom painter for the place. I guess they say a man's home is his castle. After months of trying to track Scott down, the FBI found him living out of a rented house and eating at IHOP in San Diego as a man named Russell Armstrong. Scott had stolen an ID from a man who had died in 2018. They think he had used cash to stay in hotels for a while before renting the home. When Scott was arrested, they charged him with conspiracy to commit wire fraud and mail fraud. They found that his scheme had affected people across 25 states. On August 18, 2022, he was sentenced to 10 years and was ordered to pay $501 million in restitution and penalties. Although most people often never see their money again, we hope it doesn't take too long to liquidate Scott's assets so the people who were scammed by him can have justice for the fraud committed. Imagine you're an aspiring screenwriter working on a project that just had its funding approved. You have the opportunity to travel to Indonesia to begin researching and gathering material for your script. Since you're in another country, you need to worry about your transportation, food expenses, and ensuring that you have a translator on site. You're still waiting for the funds for the project to be released, but you know that it'll happen, so you're not worried about using your own money to cover the expenses up front. You throw yourself into your work, but still spend time speaking to Hollywood executives where nothing seems out of place until one day you find out that the whole thing was a hoax. This happened to Gregory Mandarano, a screenwriter from Long Island, New York. In the summer of 2015, he traveled to Indonesia 6 times to work on an upcoming project. But Mandarano would certainly not be this scam's first or last victim. Hargobind Tahirlamani is an Indonesian man who managed to scam multiple people by impersonating males and females. Hargobind grew up in Jakarta, Indonesia, where he grew up with an affluent lifestyle. His father was a film producer and wrote rom-com and dramatic movie scripts. It was when Hargobind's mother died that his life fell apart. And then his father's death led to tension with his siblings over the family inheritance. Soon, he was cast out from his family after he and his siblings fell out over property disputes. He attended school in Jakarta before he moved to the US to attend college. In 2000, he went by the alias of Harvey when he participated in the National Forensic Association competition in persuasive speaking. He placed in the quarterfinals, and this wouldn't be the first time that he would pretend to be Harvey. However, he was disqualified from a tournament after getting caught plagiarizing. Hargobind started calling various people involved with the tournament to air out his frustrations. However, rather than making calls as himself, he decided that he needed a more powerful name that would catch people's attention. This was when people involved in the tournament started receiving calls from Cate Blanchett, who claimed to be calling to represent him. Of course, it wasn't the Australian Academy Award-winning actress that people were speaking to. It was Hargobind. Hargobind's crimes date back to the early 2000s, starting when he was still a student. Public court records state that he and a few others were a part of a lawsuit over the misappropriation of school funds. The Hollywood Reporter also discovered that he was booked for falsifying checks in Las Vegas. The Hollywood Hollywood Reporter also uncovered that he was arrested on embezzlement charges in his home country of Indonesia. It didn't take long for him to set his eyes on Hollywood, where he would commit most of his crimes. He used his knowledge of how the Hollywood industry worked to his advantage, aware that he could make people trust him if he pretended to be the right person. His ability to impersonate whoever he wanted made it easy for him to carry out some of his biggest cons. Not all of his crimes targeted celebrities. Dozens of the people he scammed were ordinary workers on sets, such as photographers, makeup artists, and stunt performers. He'd convince them to go to Indonesia, where he'd make big promises of work and high budgets to accommodate their stays. He asked the marks to pay for their own expenses, like transportation, hotels, and food, with the promise that they'd be reimbursed. What Hargobind would do is simply overcharge them for expenses. He'd be in charge of making sure his marks had what they needed. He simply acted as an overly expensive middleman. Many of them willingly did this, even if they were paying thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars in expenses. On top of his travel scam, Hargobind was also the host of the food-centric Instagram account Pure Bites. Although he never identified himself on the account, he managed to gain 50,000 followers. It used the tagline, "Every meal has a story," and he presented himself as someone who grew up in Indonesia and the US. The account had photos and videos of well-photographed meals from some of the fanciest restaurants in the United Kingdom. He'd mention his escapades exploring London's culinary scene and would use his platform to promote different restaurants. He sometimes rounded out the posts with mentions of his love life, his relationship with his parents, or the time he spent exploring London's culinary cuisine. Sometimes he told fans about struggling with potentially life-threatening illnesses such as pancreatic cancer. The Clerkenwell Boy, another faceless Instagram account, is an account that also documents restaurants in London and has 250,000 followers. One thing that Hargobind wanted more than anything was adulation. He was an opportunist and would fawn over anyone he met that he felt could help him raise his status. If he were talking to someone of high status, he would laugh too hard at their jokes or compliment them so much that it would make them uncomfortable. When he wasn't worshiping high-profile people he met, he was name-dropping other people he knew. He wanted to make it clear that he was well-connected in the London restaurant scene. Paul Hansen is a highly regarded photographer in the industry. He was contacted one day in 2018 by a man named Gavin Ambani. Ambani wanted pictures for his Instagram account and felt that Hansen would be the perfect person to take them. Ambani was Hargobind's new alias and the one that he would use to promote his Instagram account. But Ambani wouldn't accept no for an answer. He name-dropped Sarah Packer and Itamar Surlovich, the chef owners of Honey & Company, a popular Middle Eastern restaurant in London. While he claimed to have a close relationship with Packer and Surlovich, the couple only knew him as a customer at one of their restaurants. Ambani spoke to Surlovich one day about Karam Sethi, one of the people behind the Michelin-starred Gymkhana restaurant in Mayfair. When Surlovich spoke about his admiration for Sethi's work, Ambani offered to introduce them to one another. However, Sethi knew of Ambani for the wrong reasons. Ambani had gone to Sethi's restaurant, Trishna, 4 or 5 times. While Sethi saw him when he was there, he thought Ambani was just an ordinary customer. But then, after feeling disgruntled about how the staff treated him at the restaurant, Ambani sent a slew of emails complaining about the service at the restaurant, so much so that he caught Sethi's attention. According to Ambani, a staff member wasn't giving him the attention that he felt he deserved when he was there. He was heated and threatened to call Michelin and his attorneys. Sethi personally called Ambani to smooth things over, and that's when Ambani's demeanor completely changed. Rather than continuing with his threats, he expressed admiration for the chef, as if he was Sethi's superfan. Since Ambani knew some of his friends, he agreed to get a coffee with Ambani to discuss the project. Ambani told him that he grew up in India and was born into a wealthy family. He said he worked for Netflix in the UK and claimed his goal was to become a key influencer in the food world. Ambani planned to develop a gastronomy channel by developing the TV side of Instagram. Ambani called upon his restaurant friends for the locations of the 2 shoots. The first was at Zoo Tea House in Chinatown. The second shoot was done at Honey & Smoke, owned by Packer and Surlovich. In one shot, Ambani sat while several servers poured teapots with rainbow colors out in front of him to represent that Ambani was gay. At Honey & Smoke, he broke bread with Packer and Surlovich, which was supposed to be a symbol for breaking the social barriers with their Israeli Middle Eastern cooking. He went as far as to say that he stood for breaking down barriers. The shoots were successful, and the photographs were in Hansen's signature dramatic yet intimate style. Then came time for the payment, which was over £4,000. Ambani claimed that there was a technical issue and that he had to transfer money from his aunt's American bank account, which was where his money was tied up. Of course, he promised he would get Hansen the money soon. Hansen found Ambani odd, but wasn't worried about getting his money. After all, why would a fraudster show his face so much and even document his scam through public photographs? However, some time passed, and Hansen still wasn't paid. Ambani's excuses became more implausible, such as when he said he would physically deliver the money one day but then didn't show up. Other times they spoke about the money, Ambani asked for more time. Eventually, Hansen asked Srulovich to check Ambani's bank statement as he was growing suspicious over whether Ambani was who he said he was. Ambani found out about this and was furious with Hansen. He accused Hansen of defamation, a criminal act, for contacting Srulovich. He also said that Hansen telling Srulovich about the weird situation with the money made him really upset. Hansen was never paid. Hansen's photographs were still used on the Pure Bytes Instagram account, but Pure Bytes eventually removed them after receiving repeated reminders that he never paid for the work. Hargobein's next scam would be set up around him impersonating multiple executives that worked for the China Film Group, a mainland China film company that had handled several large productions. One of his victims from his China Film Group days was Gregory Mandarano. He was from Long Island, New York. As an aspiring screenwriter, he jumped at the opportunity to travel to Indonesia for an upcoming project. In the summer of 2015, he went with his writing partner to Indonesia 6 times to pursue the project. Their issue was the finances for the project. They believed the money was approved. It just had to be released. In the meantime, they would have to cover expenses themselves, understanding that they would be reimbursed when the money became available. Covering expenses for themselves was getting expensive, but they knew they had to do it while they waited for the rest of the financing. A producer for China Film Group named Anand Sippy met with the pair regularly while they were in the country. Mandarano was also in touch with many executives at China Film Group, all reassuring him that they would get their money soon. However, Mandarano was not speaking to multiple high-powered executives in the film industry as he thought. In fact, he would soon learn that he was only talking to one person the entire time. And Anand Sippy, who'd served as one of the only people they'd met in person from the China Film Group, was the mastermind behind a huge scam. He had to fund his own expenses during his 6 trips to the country. By the time he found out about the truth, he'd wasted $70,000 of his own money to cover the trips. Hargobein had many aliases. Throughout his time as a fraudster, he developed multiple personas that were male and female. All of the evidence gathered over the years makes it clear that aliases such as Gavin Ambani, Lal Gobind, and so many others were all just Hargobind. Of course, then there are the famous people he impersonated, starting back when he pretended to be Kate Blanchett. Henry Wu, a photographer, was delighted when he was contacted by Wendy Dang Murdoch, who was once married to the media mogul Rupert Murdoch. Wendy reached out to him and his partner Zori Shanchenka about taking on an assignment abroad for an exhibition that was part of the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. Hargobein began impersonating Wendy to lure Henry and Zori to Indonesia. The San Francisco-based pair are co-editors of the photography site This Life of Travel. They were flattered that Wendy reached out to them and probably hoped that it would be the start of an ongoing professional relationship. Wendy complimented them on their photography, saying it was exactly what she wanted. The project was to photograph Chinese immigrant communities in Southeast Asia and to portray the Chinese essence that these communities represented. To make the story more plausible, Hargobein added Aaron, Wendy's assistant. Henry received a call from a man named Aaron, who was supposedly Wendy Murdoch's assistant. He wanted to talk to the pair about the details of the project. After speaking for a minute with a thick New Yorker accent, he said he'd connect them with Wendy. There was a momentary pause, and then they were on the phone with her. Her accent was unique, with Asian, British, and American influences mixed together. Even though they spoke to Wendy, or at least who they thought was Wendy, the pair were becoming a little bit suspicious, and one of their anxieties was that her listed lawyer didn't seem to exist. While they were concerned, it didn't stop them from signing their contract and making plans for their trip to Indonesia. Their job was to photograph people in several cities around the country, including Jakarta. And then they were told that they would have to pay the initial costs of their airfares and other expenses, but that they would be reimbursed for everything when they were paid for the project. It was risky and meant that they had to pay thousands of dollars of their own money. They still hadn't met Wendy or Aaron in person, but this was an excellent opportunity, and they trusted that Wendy would reimburse them at the end of the project. A high-profile connection like Wendy made it worth it for them, but their excitement turned to concern when they arrived in Jakarta. Aaron called them right as they landed to tell them they'd be responsible for even more costs than they realized. Even though they were promised they'd be reimbursed, they still had to pay fees like a $1,500 photography permit that they were asked by Aaron to make payable to the driver who picked them up. The next day, they received a call from a furious Wendy, who accused the pair of racism after taking photographs of the driver. She claimed they were unauthorized and even threatened to cancel the entire project. Panicked, they promised to fix the misunderstanding. Wendy informed them that they'd have to pay for another photography permit, as the one they bought the previous day was suddenly invalid. This was when it became clear to the pair that something wasn't right, and they were confident it was some sort of scam. Many other people, like Henry, trusted Hargobind because he impersonated well-known people. The list of people that Hargobind likely impersonated is long. He imitated Megan Ellison, a film producer, Barbara Booth, Ellison's mother, and Amy Pascal. Authorities also believe that he pretended to be Star Wars producer Kathleen Kennedy, and ex-Paramount executive Shelley Lansing, and former Sony movie chief Amy Pascal. Hargobind's scams followed a similar pattern. He would offer Hollywood workers, like photographers, makeup artists, and stunt performers, a job in Indonesia. Working with people in Hollywood that were determined to bring their dreams to life made it much easier for Hargobind. Many workers are desperate for the opportunity to find their big breaks, and his scam offered them a path to the success they sought. He kept in constant contact with them as they flew to Indonesia. He would give them projects such as creating mood boards for photo shoots, enacting sides of dialogue that he sent them, or even auditions on the phone. They always thought they were close to meeting the movie's director or producer, but there were always excuses as to why the shoot was delayed. Every day that they waited to work on these movies was a day where they were forced to fork out even more of their own money. They had to pay for photo permits, driving fees, food, and whatever other expenses came up that day. Hargobind didn't do all this work in Indonesia alone, and it's believed that he had 2 accomplices that collected the money. While his execution was elaborate, at its core, he was committing advance fee fraud. Essentially, his victims were promised that they would receive their reimbursements once the movie funding was released, something that would never happen. Typically, he would pretend to be a male assistant and then have them hold to talk to people like Amy Pascal, which was an elaborate way of making them think that they were about to speak to a different person. Hargobind would pretend to be the assistant and the executive all on the same call. The executives that Hargobind was impersonating didn't know it was happening until victims started calling their offices. They wanted reimbursements for the trips and costs they incurred while in Indonesia, but the executives had no idea what they were talking about. Some of the impersonated executives hired a private security firm as they searched for answers as to why they were being accused of not paying workers. Then, in 2016 and 2019, the FBI opened its own investigation. Hargobind was arrested in Manchester, England in November 2020 at a hotel. At the time, he claimed that he was a writer for Netflix. He's additionally wanted on charges of aggravated identity theft, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and wire fraud in the U.S. A UK district judge will decide in November 2022 whether or not Hargobind will be handed over to the U.S. authorities. Some of the factors that will be considered during the trial are the amount of scams he carried out in the UK and the amount of time that has passed since the crimes occurred. Even if the extradition request is granted, it'll likely take years for Hargobind to go on trial. Authorities believe that he's convinced more people to send him money even while in jail as he's awaiting for his court date. He was duped into handing over his money right over the phone, and she was convinced to invest over $7 million with her so-called friend. Let's get right into these scammed celebrities. Number 5. Matched Up. In September 2022, British soap star Adam Rickett was scammed out of tens of thousands of pounds after a fake call came from Barclays fraud team. Adam Rickett is a British actor, singer, and model. He rose to fame in the 1990s when he played Nick Tilsley in the popular soap opera Coronation Street. The scam was an APP, which stands for an Authorized Push Payment. An APP is when someone is tricked into transferring money from their bank account to a scammer's. Criminals often pose as organizations that the victims can trust, like government bodies or other banks. APPs are becoming too familiar worldwide, particularly in the UK. These scams are now a massive threat to businesses and consumers. It's also becoming more sophisticated, where the scams are so convincing that people willingly transfer money without giving it a second thought. Impersonation scams accounted for 40% of APP frauds. British businesses and consumers dealt with a 39% increase in APP losses in 2021. Adam fell victim to this APP when Barclays Bank texted him to inform him that there was suspicious activity on his account. After being informed that their fraud department would call him, he confidently answered his phone to talk to Martin, who he believed worked for Barclays. The 0845 number that called Adam matched the fraud number on Barclays' website. Martin asked Adam the security questions associated with Adam's account. With no reason to be suspicious, Adam answered them all. Adam was shocked when Martin told him someone pretended to be him at one of his local branches in Crewe, Cheshire. The imposter tried to withdraw money, which Martin claimed would have only been possible if the person had Adam's ID and signature. Martin then stated that the person in the Crewe branch had Adam's driving license and passport. Adam put Martin on hold and called his wife, who confirmed that his driving license and passport were at their home and were not stolen. Petrified Horrified and confused, Adam turned to Martin for answers, but all he said was he would call him back. Initially, everything was normal when he checked his bank account online. Then he received another call with more details about the alleged crime. The fraud department told him it was probably an inside job, as they'd reviewed security footage of a young male who was seen talking to the bank teller and never appeared to hand over his passport. Another reason that Martin gave Adam for it being an inside job was that there wouldn't be just two people involved when there was an attempt to withdraw such a large amount of funds. Barclays should have sent Adam a notification questioning the transaction, and they alleged to be concerned that Adam didn't appear to be receiving anything. The bank recommended that he make a dummy payment in his account so that he could trigger a member of the fraud department, but the already panicked actor didn't want to. His other option was to shut down the account, but when he got back online to check it, he discovered that all his money was gone. A humiliated Adam shared his story on Twitter, @AdamRickett, to raise awareness of the scam. He told the world about how he spoke to fraudsters pretending to be Barclays Bank and how he had no reason to doubt them when they called with such a probable story. While he could talk about what happened to him, he was at a loss when it came to giving others advice to avoid the same thing happening to them. He followed the advice of an institution he trusted, but he made it clear that people must always be cautious. Adam was convinced people would laugh at him for readily giving away his information, but after hearing his story, it was clear to his followers that sophisticated scams like this could happen to anyone. Number 4. Hustling sharks. In early 2020, Barbara Corcoran lost almost $400,000 after scammers used a typo in an email chain to access a wire payment sent on her behalf. Barbara's bookkeeper, Christine, received an email from Emily, Barbara's executive assistant, that stated Christine needed to pay $388,700.11 to FFH Concept GmbH, a German company. However, Emily never sent that email. Scammers removed one letter from Emily's email address and used this to gain access to Barbara's closest employees. Many people know Barbara Corcoran as an investor on Shark Tank, but that only tells a bit of her story. She founded the Corcoran Group company while she worked at a New Jersey diner, where she had to work 18-hour days to gain capital for the business. Being a self-made millionaire hasn't been easy, and her experience led to her wanting to serve as a mentor to entrepreneurs worldwide. As one of Shark Tank's original investors, she has appeared in all 13 seasons. Corcoran was the victim of a business email compromise scam, also referred to as a BEC. This happens when scammers compromise a company's email accounts and use them to access transfers or funds. BECs are becoming common, with the FBI's 2019 Internet Crime Report saying that companies and individuals lost up to $1.7 billion in scams like this. For Corcoran, the scam was so believable that she even referred to it as clever when she spoke to CNBC Make It. As a real estate investor, it's normal for Corcoran to pay for renovations in her buildings. Therefore, Christine wasn't suspicious when Emily requested the wire transfer for renovations to some of Barbara's German properties, and it never occurred to her to double-check Emily's email. Before she sent the wire transfer, Christine asked some standard questions, ensuring that she understood the purpose of the money before doing anything. The money was for FFH Concept GmbH, and the bank details were for GLS, Gemeinschaftsbank EG, both legitimate companies in Germany. With no reason to be suspicious, Christine sent the wire transfer. Later in the day, Christine went to email Emily and realized that her email address was different from the one she had communicated with earlier that day. Emily looked back on Christine's email correspondence with the scammers and found that the scammers altered her email address. Once they uncovered the hoax, they put Barbara's IT in charge of tracing the scammers' IP addresses. Soon, IT discovered that the scammers were from China, not Germany. It only took 3 days for the money to return to her bank account. The German bank that the scammers used learned about the hoax and froze the money before it could go any further. She believes that the media attention that the scam got and pressure from her New York bank to the German bank is why she got it back so quickly. All it took for the ordeal to play out was a discreet typo in an email, which few people verify when they receive an email from a coworker. Number 3. Scamming Saints. Legendary former New Orleans Saints quarterback Drew Brees and his wife Brittany filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against a San Diego jeweler, Vahid Moradi, after being misled into investing millions of dollars in diamonds that they later learned were severely overpriced. Drew and his wife saw an investment opportunity in the diamonds sold by Vahid Muradi, owner of C.J. Charles Jewelers. Vahid even told them that they should expect the diamonds to appreciate up to 200%, making it an exciting opportunity for the couple who wanted to set up a steady income for Drew's eventual retirement. The purchases spanned over 4 years, from 2012 to 2016. Vahid and Drew's relationship began in 2003 when Drew began shopping at Muradi's store. Breeze and his wife became long-term customers of Vahid's and would buy watches, jewels, and diamonds from him. They formed a strong friendship and invited each other to family gatherings and charitable events. The filing also alleged that Vahid's prices increased as the Breezes and Vahid grew closer. Between 2008 and 2009, Muradi brought their attention to the benefits of investing in colored diamonds. With little knowledge of the industry, Breeze trusted his friend. Later, he would claim that Muradi masqueraded as an expert in investment-grade diamonds. Between 2012 and 2016, the couple bought $15 million worth of jewelry from Vahid, including an $8 million diamond ring. It wasn't until 2017, when he met with an independent appraiser, that he found out how much money he lost in the investments. The appraiser delivered the unfortunate news that Vahid overestimated the value of the Breeze's investments by $7 million, and the ring that Breeze thought cost $8 million was only worth $3.75 million. At the center of the lawsuit were 8 items the couple claimed were worth $9 million less than what they paid. These were the items they had individually appraised and became the catalyst for the lawsuit. Vahid told a different tale, claiming that the couple wanted a refund on their investment because it didn't appreciate in the way they wanted. Eric George, Muradi's lawyer, made a statement that highlighted Drew's brash behavior when it came to obtaining refunds for his large purchases. George alleged that the independent appraiser that the couple saw was the one that misled them by telling them that their items were worth less than they paid Vahid. While the couple accused Muradi of marking up the pieces they purchased from him, Muradi claimed his markups to be within the normal range for his industry, while in the suit, Breeze's attorney accused Vahid of being misleading in the diamond's values. Since jewelers handle markups at their discretion, nothing stopped him from charging the high amounts he did. Legally, the jewelry industry is complicated. The market fluctuates unpredictably, but the issue of appraisals is also vital to address. Often done for insurance purposes, there might be guidelines when performing them, but that doesn't mean that every appraiser is guaranteed to land on the same number when determining the value. In this case, Vahid's role changed from jeweler to investment advisor when he started to make claims about the eventual appreciation of the stones. Drew and Brittany needed to understand the intricacies of investing in diamonds. Unlike gold, diamonds don't have universal prices per gram. Without strong industry knowledge, they leaned on Vahid to help them pick the diamonds that would make the best investments rather than deciding for themselves. The jury ultimately voted in favor of the couple and awarded them $6.1 million. Vahid was ruled against as the jury believed he committed a breach of contract, breach of fiduciary duty, and 2 counts of fraud. Vahid originally planned on appealing the ruling, maintaining that he didn't commit fraud or mislead Drew and Brittany. If the judge granted his appeal, the couple might have been asked to return the money. In October 2019, Vahid dropped his appeal, and in November, the Breezes' settlement money was increased to $10.3 million to account for legal fees and interest on the judgment. There doesn't appear to be bad blood between either party, with Breezes' lawyer making it clear that they reached an amicable solution of their disputes. Number 2. Unfriended. In 2013, 28-year-old Andre C. Hicks was found guilty of obtaining $2.3 million by defrauding investors through a fraudulent hedge fund investment scheme from March 2011 to October 2011. He misled investors by lying about his experience and background and used that deception to steal roughly $2 million. Investors believe that Andre had 2 degrees from Harvard University and thought that he was qualified because he claimed that he used to work for Barclays Capital as a hedge fund manager. He used his lies to get people to invest in Locust Offshore Management, his fake hedge fund. When hedge funds lost 5% of their trading profit that year, Andre claimed that Locust Offshore Management earned an 80% profit. 10 people invested in Andre's alleged hedge fund, but he never utilized the funds for their intended purpose. Instead, he used them for personal reasons and to fund his lavish lifestyle. Chris Humphries, basketball player and ex-husband to Kim Kardashian, was one of the people that lost hundreds of thousands of dollars due to Andre's deception. Andre and Chris had a personal relationship, and he even attended the basketball Player's 2011 rehearsal dinner and wedding to Kim Kardashian. Not only did Andre con Kris into investing hundreds of thousands of dollars into his hedge fund, but he also claimed to have an affair with Kim Kardashian when she was engaged to Kris Humphrey. Andre sent an email to a website that he alleged was written by Kim, where she supposedly wrote about her relationship with Hicks. The email claimed that the two were intimate in Monaco before the wedding and expressed her remorse. Kim and her lawyer, Marty Singer, vehemently denied these claims and penned a letter where they called Hicks a swindling convict and a liar. He dismissed the email as fake and swore she never wrote it. Singer took it a step further, threatening to make Andre take a lie detector test if he kept lying about the affair. Andre's lies were exposed in court when the jury learned that he dropped out of Harvard after 3 semesters. He let people believe that he developed his mathematical models to aid his investing style, only for the public to find out that he got a D in the only math course he took. Andre also never managed a hedge fund at Barclays Capital. Everything he told investors was a lie, and their money never went towards investments. He used it for himself instead. In 2013, Andre was sentenced to 40 months in prison by U.S. federal judge Patty Sayers. He was also ordered to pay $2.3 million in restitution. Number 1. No trust. California conman Troy Stratos stole $30 million from multiple people. He performed such elaborate fraudulent schemes that it took years and an FBI investigation to expose him. After her 2006 divorce from actor Eddie Murphy, Nicole Murphy gained a hefty settlement of $15 million, but instead she handed $7 million right over to Troy. As a successful businessman who earned his fortune from oil investment, Troy stepped forward and said he would take control of her portion of the proceeds in the divorce. He persuaded her to let him manage not just her money, but also real estate in her name and jewelry. Nicole and Troy had been friends since they were teenagers, and at the time, she could see no reason not to trust him. The money was supposed to be invested overseas in countries such as Dubai and the United Emirates, where her proceeds would earn a high rate of return. He also promised to pay her expenses since all her money was now overseas. Everything that Troy promised to Nicole was a lie. He never invested her money overseas. Instead, he diverted it to his account for personal use to fund his extravagant lifestyle. Rather than using his own money for her expenses as he promised, he used portions of the money she initially gave him. Between February 2007 and April 2007, Troy's bookkeeper received a subpoena that demanded access to some of his various financial records and included documents about Troy's spending spree in Las Vegas, where he might have used Nicole's money. He forced his bookkeeper to withhold records. Unfortunately, Nicole wasn't Troy's only victim. From December 2010 to February 2012, Troy began his next scheme. By this point, his name had too many negative postings on the internet for people to trust him. He developed the alias Ken Dennis and began working with his next victim, Tim Burns. Tim was a financial manager in Pennsylvania, and investors trusted him with their money. Some of his clients were interested in Facebook stock, and Troy offered to help. Troy claimed to represent Carlos Slim, one of the wealthiest people in the world, worth up to $62 billion. He claimed that Carlos was interested in purchasing a large amount of Facebook shares and said he could sell Tim favorably priced shares in excess of Carlos Slim's purchases. As well as touting his relationship with Carlos Slim, Troy boasted his connections with Facebook insiders, including creator and CEO Mark Zuckerberg and the company's CFO. He alleged that there would be access to more significant amount of stock in Facebook, starting at 2 million shares and going up to 40 million. Troy gained Tim's trust, and Burns sent $11,250,000 in wire transfers to purchase the stock. Tim sent the first transfer to Venable LLP, the law firm that Stratos retained. The other 2 transfers went to accounts that Troy controlled. However, Tim grew impatient when the deal didn't close. Troy kept promising that the papers would be signed any minute. While he offered Tim a refund, he emphasized that it would be a huge mistake, as he would always regret giving up the opportunity to make money off the shares. Troy was arrested by the FBI on December 20th, 2011 for his fraud scheme against Nicole Myers. Even then, he didn't let that stop him from communicating with Tim, still trying to convince him through text and phone calls that their deal would go through soon. In December 2016, Troy was sentenced by the United States District Judge Troy L. Nunley to 21 years and 10 months in prison. He was charged with multiple counts of money laundering, wire fraud, mail fraud, and obstruction of justice. U.S. Attorney Talbert referred to Troy's schemes as staggering in their scope and audacity, saying that Troy preyed upon his victims to satisfy his own voracious greed and desire for a lavish lifestyle. Special agent in charge, Monica M. Miller of the FBI's Sacramento field office, stated that despite the complexity of his lies to conceal his schemes, Troy Stratos is, quite simply, a common con artist. She also clarified that the FBI will identify and investigate individuals who perpetrate such large-scale fraud to ensure they face justice for their crimes. The court justified the harshness of his sentence by the trauma inflicted on the victims. The FBI investigation on Troy found that he fraudulently obtained roughly $43 million beginning in 1996 and ending with his arrest in 2011. Who are some of the most heartless scammers out there? Let's get right into their scams. Number 4, Boston hedge fund scamager. A Boston hedge fund operation was accused of running a Ponzi scheme that included spending investor money on liquor, luxury hotels, and specialty cars. The top securities regulator in Massachusetts barred Murakami and his 3 hedge funds from any securities business. Murakami had already drained the bank accounts of investors for his own benefit. And who were his first victims? His family and friends. A hedge fund is a partnership that includes private investors whose capital is managed by seasoned fund managers that employ a variety of tactics, such as trading in non-traditional assets to generate above-average returns on investment. Murakami began his first hedge fund in 2007 with his MC2 Capital Partners Fund. The fund was marketed mainly to friends and family members because if he's going to steal from anyone, it may as well be people who know and love him, taking in more than $3.5 million. Murakami had no discernible strategy and lost nearly $600,000 in the first 3 months. By the end of the next year, the fund had a negative balance of roughly $2.4 million. So Murakami started a second fund, MC2 Capital Value Partners Fund, which ended with similar catastrophic losses. And Murakami, being the solid guy that he is, had actively worked to hide those losses from investors by soliciting more investments and supplying misleading performance numbers. Next, Murakami struck a deal with another hedge fund to start MC2 Capital Canadian Opportunities Fund, which then allowed him to get investors to give him even more money. Murakami then used that new money to pay out investors in the other 2 MC2 funds. While investors were waiting for their promised returns, Murakami was buying a sports car, traveling, enjoying high-end shopping trips, staying in luxury hotels, and of course, racking up $1,000 restaurant bills. In all, Murakami stole more than $15.3 million from at least 47 investors. Murakami was eventually investigated and arrested for his Ponzi hedge fund scheme. When initially summoned to testify before the enforcement section of the Securities Division, Murakami pled the fifth, but with the piles of evidence against him, Murakami changed his plea of the fifth to guilty and admitted to withholding information regarding the hedge fund and to providing investors with falsified account statements to fool them into thinking their investments were safe. Murakami was sentenced to 6 years in prison and ordered to pay more than $10.5 million in restitution. Ponzi's never work, but these clowns keep trying. Number 3, left feeling dumb. David Auble is a professional con man who's very good at telling people what they want to hear. Auble ran a scam that stole millions of dollars from at least 12 investors, some of whom lost their entire life savings. One woman, believing Auble's company was real, lost $50,000 after buying into what she thought was a solid investment. The woman had complete faith in Auble after he'd given her a fake stock certificate she believed to be authentic, but was left feeling dumb when she found out it was totally worthless, just like David Auble. Auble and his partner, Nelson Garcia, operated a company they ironically named Angel Investments and claimed to sell shares from startup companies which could be turned into equity after 1 year. Auble and Garcia also promised investors quarterly returns of 8.25% or more, raking in more than $2.4 million. The companies were real, but the stocks were not. While the money never actually went to the startups, Auble did spend all that money on the betterment of mankind, or rather, a very specific part of mankind. This betterment included spending roughly $15,000 at restaurants, because these guys always have to overspend at restaurants, $515,000 on family members, and over $31,000 on entertainment, along with making $138,578 cash withdrawals, probably all in singles if you get our drift, and $673,000 on credit cards. Auble had no qualms about spending other people's life savings, eating too much, and putting young women through college. much. Sadly, those victims only ever got about 5% returned to them. About 5 years before Angel Investments, Abel and a co-conspirator named Robert Raffa got themselves arrested and charged for their investment in a scheme to manipulate the market for penny stock company Green Energy Renewable Solutions, Inc., who claimed to develop and operate waste processing and recycling facilities. Raffa and Abel had used foreign accounts to sneakily acquire nearly all of Green Energy's unrestricted stock without reporting their controlling interests. Then, they started an email campaign promoting Green Energy to potential investors, while selling their shares at the same time. If you think that sounds illegal and shady, it is, and we're proud of your intuition. Raffa and Abel were able to sell more than 1.5 million shares of Green Energy stock, making roughly $900,000. Raffa and Abel still controlled a large amount of Green Energy after that first round, so they used more manipulative trading techniques to stabilize Green Energy stock price until they could run a second campaign. That second campaign was actually run by a stock promoter who was working with an undercover federal agent. The agent pretended to have access to a ring of corrupt stockbrokers who would buy shares for kickbacks. Raffa and Abel sold 174,000 shares of their Green Energy stock to one of these corrupt brokers, then sent a $6,000 kickback payment, and in return got themselves arrested. Abel pled guilty, was charged with bail jumping after he repeatedly failed to show up for sentencing. Eventually, U.S. Marshals drug Abel to court by the scruff of his neck like a puppy about to get its nose rubbed in the accident it left on the rug. Abel got 87 months in prison, 5 years of supervised release, and had to pay $242,553 in restitution. The judge also probably firmly shouted "no" and told him that he was bad, very, very bad, but that was left out of court reports. Back in the present, the Office of Financial Regulation arrested David Abel and Nelson Garcia on charges related to their involvement in the $2.4 million angelic investment scheme. Abel was extradited from a federal prison where he had already been serving out his sentence for a previous securities fraud scheme. Garcia claims that Abel destroyed his life with the victims and that he was tricked, hoodwinked, bamboozled, and most of all, snookered, rapaciously snookered. Garcia gave an interview while under house arrest and claimed Abel used a phony name and phony documents to convince Garcia that he was legit. Now Garcia says he's out of work and broke, making this claim despite court records showing that he was paid more than $352,000. Garcia faces charges of engaging in a securities fraud, conspiracy, and unlicensed telemarketing. As if regular telemarketing wasn't bad enough, this guy didn't even have a license. Abel was charged of securities fraud, unlicensed telemarketing, 3 counts of money laundering, and engaging in an organized scheme to defraud. Being the naughty little bail jumper he is, Abel was denied bail and is currently awaiting trial. Number 2. Millennium Mobster. America's not-so-sweetheart, Nancy Carol Spinks, stole over $8.6 million through money laundering from 23 victims at Millennium Title, an escrow company in Florida. Carol stole the money clients had entrusted to her through real estate sales and closings, 1,041 exchanges, and in the heinous case of Jeremiah Adam Wright, life insurance funds. Jeremiah was tragically killed in a motorcycle accident, leaving a wife and 2 little girls to fend for themselves. Jeremiah's widow hired Carol to create a trust account for the $100,000 the family would receive in insurance funds. Carol told the family that when she got the funds, she would deposit them in a court registry in Wise County. Then she kept it, because apparently Carol needed a new car more than she needed her soul. Seriously, who steals from a widow and her children? Texas insurance regulators took over Carol's title company, Millennium Title, after she disappeared with millions of dollars. The Texas Department of Insurance, or TDI, said that Millennium Title had less than $10,000 available to pay over $100,000 in bills. Title companies hold deposits in escrow for real estate buyers, earnest money, down payments on homes, or profits from real estate sales, like a trusted friend that holds the money until it's ready to be paid out. A few days before the takeover, a neighbor said he noticed someone moving out of Carol's upscale Keller home in the middle of the night. By the next day, the house was empty and no one knew where Carol was. At the time of her disappearance, there was $3 million missing from the company's escrow accounts and $2 million from separate investor accounts. Carol had vanished for over a month, but was eventually found and arrested in Lake Forest, a swanky suburb of Chicago, where she was renting a house for about $8,500 a month and had started a moving truck business. Carol was caught when she was eating at a Chicago mall when her husband, Bubba, of course his name was Bubba, 23 years her junior, used her PayPal card to pay for the food. Mall security She was notified when the account was flagged, and Carol was arrested while walking to her 16-year-old son's Mercedes. Carol was known for her excessive and outrageous spending habits. She seemed entirely too proud of her opulent lifestyle that included fur coats. Seriously, who still wears fur coats beside Cruella de Vil? A fleet of Mercedes and horses. She also was found to have spent roughly $12,500 on a Taylor Swift concert, $4,300 to attend the Academy of Country Music Awards, and $100,000 on a second wedding. Carol was also particularly cavalier when it came to her various criminal activities. At one point, while in custody, Carol was heard on a recorded phone call with her mother, laughing about her crimes, dismissing them as only white-collar, calling herself Millennium Mobster after her title company, and openly mocking the idea that she'd do any time for stealing $8 million. Which, by the way, is a really strange way to behave when you're already incarcerated for your crimes and you're aware that your phone call is being recorded. The next time you're incarcerated for stealing $8 million, probably don't do that. In a different recorded call before her time in jail, Carol called her mother from her Lake Forest home, talking about how she wanted to get in touch with the publisher of The Wolf of Wall Street. Carol had apparently been hard at work writing the first chapter of her biography/movie, Everything That Glitters Is Not Gold, which would star America's other sweetheart, Reese Witherspoon. In a very Michael Scott move, she also had her cover planned out, her own hands in handcuffs, holding a Louis Vuitton handbag. It sounds awesome. While incarcerated in Lake Forest, Carol had another recorded call with Bubba, who was likely to be played by Chris Hemsworth in her blockbuster We're Sure, and told him to withdraw all the funds from her bank accounts. Carol wanted to liquidate her assets so they couldn't be seized by the man while she was bankrupting her company. This is also illegal, by the way, so probably don't do this either. During Carol's proceedings, there was talk of a probation plea deal where a judge orders the offender to prison for a shorter time, then suspends the remainder of the sentence in favor of probation. The hope is that the experience of prison would provide an effective deterrent from recidivism, but TDI said they would vigorously oppose any form of early probation because of Carol's brazenness and lack of remorse. Ultimately, Carol was sentenced to 10 years in prison as part of a plea agreement and was ordered to pay $8.6 million in restitution. Sadly, of $8.6 million Carol was ordered to pay back, only $3.6 million will be covered by the Texas Department of Insurance's Policy Guarantee Fund. Those who lost money on the 1,031 exchanges, which is when an investor swaps out an investment property for another to defer capital gains or losses, have no recourse under Texas law. During her sentencing, Carol was visibly crying as her 10-year prison sentence was handed down. Number 1. Superannuations. 24-year-old Jasmine Vela Arpachi was part of a cybercrime syndicate that stole millions of dollars from Australian superannuation and share trading accounts. Old Jazzy Pants was the only heartless piece of crap caught in the scheme, which involved over $3 million being taken from superannuations and over $238,000 from share trading accounts. Superannuations are essentially Australia's retirement pension benefit funds, similar to a 401k with mandatory contributions made by the employer. Vela Arpachi was stealing money from retirement funds and described accounts for those at the age of eligibility, about to retire, for access as the ultimate jackpot. An elderly couple in their 80s and 90s spoke of the hopelessness they felt when learning they had been targeted in the scam, finding out they'd lost everything. Another woman revealed she was literally weeks from retirement when her entire $500,000 life savings was stolen. Her criminal syndicate self-identified as Team Awesome. Vela Arpachi was involved in a phishing scam where the attacker sends a fraudulent message designed to trick a person into revealing sensitive information to access account login details she purchased on the dark web. Vela Arpachi mainly targeted businesses with HR, admin, or bookkeeper usernames, hoping they would have access to superannuation account details. Jasmine also manipulated identification documents to change names or dates of birth, then stamping them with a false certification stamp. Those details were then used to withdraw funds and arrange shares to be sold, with proceeds deposited in newly opened bank accounts. Debit cards from the new accounts were then sent to fake addresses in Hong Kong to launder proceeds. Vela Arpachi would then get her cut of the money in cryptocurrency. When Vela Arpachi wasn't available to steal money herself, she left instructions on her computer for her sub explaining how to steal debit cards using stolen identification documents from vacant houses' mailboxes. Her instructions suggested dressing like an office worker or a real estate agent when grabbing the cards in order to remain inconspicuous. Vela Arpaci even planned for nosy neighbors, suggesting to park down the street and pretend to be on a phone call or just returning an hour later. Once Vela Arpaci had the cards in her grubby little Vela Arpaci paws, she sent them straight to Hong Kong. However, the cards would have to be activated, so Smooth Jazz would notify the bank that the account holder was overseas to prevent any fraud alerts. Vela Arpaci's scheme came to an end when she was finally arrested after a joint investigation by the Australian Federal Police and Australian Securities and Investment Commission. At the time of her arrest, police found roughly 1,400 documents on her computer, including driver's license, passports, and Medicare cards. Vela Arpaci was paid more than $147,000 in Bitcoin for her involvement in stealing from old people. In total, there were 26 victims and roughly $3 million pilfered from the superannuation accounts and $238,000 in shares that were stolen and sold. Of that, over $2.5 million was laundered through the syndicate. Fortunately, the syndicate failed when it attempted to take an extra $1.8 million in Superfund money, as well as $5.75 million worth of shares before Vela Arpaci was caught. Jasmine Vela Arpaci faced a whopping 53 counts of fraud and theft. She has since pleaded guilty. She completely scammed her best friend with a fake job because she didn't want to lose her friendship, and he promised to invest his friends' and family's money in real estate, but you guessed it, he didn't. Let's get right to the worst scammers who scammed their friends and family. Number 4, job offer. Helen Dove decided to spin an elaborate web of lies that led to almost £50,000 in lost wages for her best friend. But why? Kimberly Baker didn't know that her life was about to take a turn for the worse when she met Helen Dove at a riding school at St. Helens, Merseyside in January 2017. Both women soon became very close, and Kimberly confided in Helen about a lifelong dream she had. Kimberly had always wanted to pursue a career in child safeguarding and had gotten all the qualifications needed for that career in her spare time. When Helen heard that, she happily informed her new friend that she was currently an adoption worker and that there was a perfect position opening up soon for Kimberly at her office. When poor Kimberly heard this, she was, of course, super happy with the news. She was finally going to get her dream job. What she didn't know was that she was about to embark on a wild goose chase that would last several months, courtesy of her deceptive friend Helen. The interesting thing about this goose chase is that Helen would end up not gaining any money from it, yet she did it anyway. After Helen told her friend about this position at her fake job, she encouraged Kimberly to take voluntary redundancy from her BT job and apply for the open position. Once the application was lodged, Helen started spinning her web of lies by sending Kimberly a series of emails confirming her appointment. She sent over 1,000 emails from around 15 fake email addresses, all in a bid to assure her that she had a job waiting for her. When Kimberly started getting curious because she wasn't receiving a salary and hadn't gotten a contract since she sent her application, the lies got even more creative. There was always some sort of delay stopping the contract from being sent over, and she was warned sternly not to appear at the job physically because the job offer was confidential. Kimberly had unwittingly found herself in a situation where she was conversing with 15 different fake email accounts, waiting on a contract that was never going to come, and even performing routine administrative duties that were nothing more than the inventions of her supposed best friend. Fortunately, she didn't have to endure being spun around forever. After 7 months of postponed meetings with baseless excuses, Kimberly eventually began to smell the coffee. She wondered if she was just being led around, so she confronted her friend and asked her if she truly worked at the Borough Council. Helen was unwilling to give herself up, so she forged payslips and presented them to Kimberly as evidence that she was indeed a social worker. Kimberly wasn't convinced, so she went to the office herself and discovered that no one with her friend's name worked there. That was when the entire web of lies started unraveling. After realizing that she was being played, she went to the police to complain. At this point, Helen was yet to realize that her friend was onto her, so she made the mistake of sending an email with a tracking number that could be traced to a post office. Kimberly went to the post office, got the time the letter was sent, and checked CCTV records. That was when she saw her friend Helen handing in the fake contract letter to be posted. That was the definitive proof the police needed to know Helen was behind Kimberly's 7 wasted months, and she was promptly arrested. The case was so strange strange that the detective in charge said he had never seen anything like it in his career. Helen had built this incredible web of lies for no other reason than she could do it. The numerous forgeries and lies had provided her no monetary gain and had only resulted in heartbreak and pain for her best friend. But she did it anyway. The fraud didn't just have an immense psychological effect on Kimberly, it also had a huge financial one. She had resigned from her job and remained unemployed for 7 months. This meant she couldn't finance her wedding that was coming up at about the same time and couldn't even buy Christmas presents for her children. Helen comforted her through all these despite being the cause of her misfortune. Kimberly said her only wish was that Helen had gotten a few more years, as Helen was sentenced for 2 years and 8 months. Number 3. Rally Ponzi. Joshua Hutchins was a seemingly successful businessman, but he turned out to be a con artist who scammed everyone around him. Hutchins seemed like a normal businessman on the outside. He owned 2 successful businesses, had a beautiful wife, and was comfortably upper middle class. But beneath all this, Joshua was hiding a dirty secret. His business was unsustainable, and he was essentially running a Ponzi scheme. His real estate business was merely a front to defraud people. He attracted investments from local investors and his friends by promising to use their money to develop certain properties. Instead of spending the money on properties that investors were interested in, he spent it on personal expenses and personal properties. He promised investors that promissory notes would be secured by a deed of trust which would safeguard their money. He did no such thing and lied to investors that their funds were safe. Since he diverted business funds for his personal use, he wasn't able to develop and sell the properties as expected. Investors soon got suspicious when they noticed that he couldn't pay the promised returns. Their suspicions were confirmed when they realized that they couldn't foreclose on the investment properties because there was no legally binding deed of trust. This meant that their investments were lost forever. While all this was happening and his life was unraveling before his eyes, his wife left him. This sent Joshua spiraling to the worst depths he had ever been to. He started sending her threatening messages. He sent these messages to both his wife and her friends. The threats were severe enough that the police had to step in. Thankfully, he was arrested before he could do any real damage. Joshua was eventually found guilty of his many crimes in a court of law. The court found that he had defrauded people up to the tune of $1.5 million. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison due to the severity of his crimes. He was also asked to pay back roughly $1.2 million to his victims as restitution. After serving his time in prison, he would also have to serve 3 years of supervised relief. Number 2. I'm the captain now. Jody Oliver was several things to many people. To his wife and 3 children, he was a businessman working the motor trade, a partner at a funeral home, and an employee at a gaming machine company. However, he was a high-ranking executive at Jaguar Land Rover to his boyfriend, who knew nothing about his wife and children. He led double lives, and no one in either life knew about the existence of the other. However, Jody wasn't just a husband and a boyfriend. He also happened to be an especially skilled con man. He was neither a director at Jaguar Land Rover nor a businessman working in the motor trade. He was a con artist who led an unsustainable lifestyle and had thousands of dollars in gambling debt to pay. Jody didn't make nearly enough to offset his debt and live his double life. So he decided to get a bit creative with earning money. He planned to target the friends and families of his boyfriends and make them pay for fake exotic vacation trips on a cruise ship. To achieve this, he bought a fake captain suit and wore it to meetings with potential victims. He was offering trips at absurdly low prices, so many people jumped at this offer. There was no reason not to believe him. After all, he had a captain's suit. By the time Jody was done, he had scammed around £320,000 from his victims. Jody's scam targeted seniors who were looking to have a fun vacation for cheap. He told them about a phantom luxury cruise that wasn't only magnificent beyond their wildest dreams, but also cheap. The seniors jumped at the opportunity to go on the trip, and they eventually regretted it. Christy and Kevin Evans are 2 perfect examples of the people Jody targeted. They were seniors who were friends with Jody's boyfriend's grandmother. They had booked several cruises because Captain Jody, as they called him, was offering unbelievable prices. There were many other people he scammed in the same way. One of his victims, a cab driver, heard about the unbelievable cruise deals Captain Jody had to offer, and he immediately sought him out to see if he could get a luxury cruise for cheap as well. Jody was able to scam about 16 friends and families of his boyfriend in total. He kept the scam running for a long while and kept coming up with different excuses when his victims asked when they would go on the cruise. He finally met his Waterloo when the family of one of his victims was set and packed for a luxury cruise that didn't exist. This led to a police investigation, which in turn led to Jody's arrest. After his arrest, all of this scammer's secrets were out. His secret families knew about one another, and they couldn't believe that they had been deceived for so long. His wife said that she was disgusted and shocked when she learned about her husband's escapades, and she promptly sought separation from him. Another victim of his said that his actions were so detestable that they made her lose faith in human nature. Number 1. My parents are investing too. Edward Mathis seemed to be an everyday financial advisor who had an everyday job. But this banker instead carried out a $2.6 million investment scheme that defrauded his clients including his parents. He worked as an independent broker-dealer for Mutual of Omaha Investor Services, Inc. What this meant was that he had the power to solicit investment funds from private citizens and help them invest them in accounts without oversight from a bigger organization. Edward used this position to convince seniors in his community to invest in fictitious Mutual of Omaha accounts that he claimed would perform extremely well. He started convincing seniors in 2013, and by 2019, he had convinced over a dozen people to invest their retirement savings into accounts that did not exist. Edward even convinced his parents to do the same as well. He went as far as forging quarterly earnings reports to hoodwink his victims when they asked about their portfolios. Instead of investing the monies he was trusted with, Edward took all of it and used it to pay off his bills. He used the money to pay off credit card debt, pay child support payments, purchase and renovate his home, and even spend around $80,000 at Tiffany's. He was able to gain the trust of multiple respected citizens in his community because he was also a leader in that community. Before he stepped down due to allegations of financial impropriety, Edward was the president of the Downtown Oconomowoc Business Association. His standing in the community meant that he was trusted, and people saw no reason to doubt his claims. But his scam could not last forever. One of his victims reported him to the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority after they received a suspicious quarterly earnings report. The authority contacted Mutual of Omaha, which was the entity Edward lied that he was investing monies with. Mutual of Omaha then escalated the matter and paid a visit to Edward's offices, where it was established that he was defrauding multiple people at once. And with that, his jig was up. Over the next few months, law enforcement uncovered the depth of Edward's fraud and discovered that he had scammed people of around $2.6 million since 2013. During his sentencing, two of his victims gave impact statements that outlined just how devastating his scam was to them and their savings. The judge agreed with them and said that Edward betrayed the trust of members of his community and used his relationship with them to steal their retirement savings. He was sentenced to 63 months in prison for his scam. Hailing from one of the wealthiest and most notorious families in D.C., Todd Hitt had a reputation that preceded him. The Hitts were already a local staple. Known as one of Washington's wealthiest construction dynasties, the Hitt family had been in charge of building many architectural gems throughout the city. The Downtown W Hotel, the Glenstone Museum, and part of the National Park. His family heritage dated back to 1937, when his grandparents launched their business firm in Arlington at their dinner table. After that, his father, Russell Hitt, took the company to new heights and turned it into one of the most profitable contracting companies in the U.S. His rise up the ranks was a bit unusual. He didn't start working with his family's business right away. According to the Washingtonian, Todd Hitt created his own home building business working on projects based in North Arlington, where he grew up. A few years went by and his company disappeared. He then became a soccer coach. That's when he decided to turn his life around aggressively. He even went as far as publicly saying he had a degree from Wharton to create this illusion of a successful businessman. By the time he turned 49, Hitt started what would be his first major real estate deal, developing a forgotten area in the city for prime real estate. At the time, the only thing standing in that area was an Applebee's. He made the weird transition from soccer coach to real estate developer in no time. Hitt made sure the local news were informed about it and started getting news articles written about his astonishing project and daring business venture. Knowing how to work people your way is the secret to success in the business world. This is a skill that Hitt knew very well, as he used it to his advantage to scam his way into success by using Washington, D.C.'s elite as his personal checkbook. It wasn't long before he was discovered, but he made sure everyone believed he was a prominent businessman in the process. Within just a few short years, Hit was able to establish himself in the game. He created Kidder Capital, an equity business with which he approached DC's highest elite to convince them to invest in his projects. Hit became known for his relaxed yet overly confident approach to friends and acquaintances. Dinner and drinks would be paid, and his family name would be tossed around as a way to gain future investors' trust. Hit made them believe he was investing his own pocket into the project, while in reality, he was putting in way less than he told his investors. By stating he had skin in the game, investors felt their money was being taken care of by someone who managed the project with the required seriousness. Kidder Capital began to grow quickly. The company was investing millions in several projects in the area, including a $6 million deal in a plot of land where the Silver Line metro stop would be built. Hit made sure his team was living the big life. During sport matches, he would fly his team to different cities and get them thousands of dollars worth of wardrobe. Interestingly, his team didn't seem to be as experienced. Most of the team was comprised of 20 to 30-year-olds with little to no knowledge in investment. The majority came from a marketing background. Half of the company worked in marketing, including two of Hit's daughters. Hit made sure he was marketing the company in the big leagues. He even went as far as saying they had offices in London and Palm Springs, which was obviously not the case. All of this as a strategy to pull in more investors. Given his lack of business knowledge, it comes as no surprise Hit started using the company's projects as his personal bank. There were clients he refused to invest with once he had originally signed deals because he was simply not interested. Turns out he had spent all the investors' money. He had raised an additional $8 million for the Silver Line project, but most of it went to pay his astonishing credit card bills that included over $85,000 in private jet trips, almost $60,000 in jewelry from Bulgari, and close to $13,000 in luxury hotel bills. Hit knew how to work people in DC. Charity galas and non-profit events became his go-to so he could approach the city's elite. He turned himself into a philanthropist in the blink of an eye. These events became the best opportunity he and his team had to network and make profitable business connections. His Kidder after-hour parties were the perfect opportunity to shake hands with some of the most influential people in the city. The exclusive celebration was held at the Georgetown Four Seasons and was filled with tech executives and real estate connoisseurs. Hand-rolled cigars and ultra-expensive champagne were handed by models, a lavish display of his ambition. Hit made sure everybody knew he had become a charity benefactor. The press would be present at all of his events. On one occasion, he was invited to Hope Multiplied's annual charity gala and the intention of becoming one of the nonprofit's main benefactors. Hit pledged to make a donation of $50,000, and after being told that most donations were usually anonymous, he told the director to make it public to the audience. Many well-known DC philanthropists were very surprised with Hit's rapid rise in the press. He was even included in a 2018 philanthropy issue of Washington Life magazine. According to a report by the Washingtonian, other prominent local figures who were included on the magazine's issue weren't even aware of his existence and stated they were surprised with his presence and sudden popularity. Hit's business dealings were starting to garner an infamous reputation. Back in 2016, Kidder Capital was in the middle of a $2 million disbursement for an investment in Aquacore, a tech startup. After paying only the first half of their financial obligation, Hit called in to say they were no longer going to pay the rest of the money. Although an agreement had been established, Hit backed out at the last minute, stating he just had a change of mind, something highly uncommon in the venture capital world. A lot of investors were already suspicious about his attitude, mainly because of his relative inexperience in the game. This confirmed it. Aquacore didn't request the money again. As with many business-obsessed people, Hit's manners left a lot to be desired, and according to many accounts from Hit's past as a soccer coach, his temper was nothing less than extreme. Lindsay Bowers, a former player who at the time was only a teenager, reported Hit had been verbally abusive to her. During a practice, Bowers was joking with a fellow teammate when Hit approached her and insulted her aggressively. This wasn't a standalone event. He was reported to have threatened another kid on his team with knocking his teeth off and sending him to the hospital after he thought the teen had rolled his eyes at him. After Bowers made a formal complaint with the Virginia Youth Soccer Association, Hit was punished and suspended from coaching for 6 months. After this, he came back as if nothing happened. Many believed it was his connections that allowed to get such a low punishment. His personal life also became a source of confusion for his employees. His wife Susan would drop by the office, and only minutes later, after she left, his mistress Michelle Donisky would be seen entering the company. Their affair had become a known secret for everyone in the company. The fact that Nasky was in the middle of her divorce from her former partner made it even weirder. Added to this, Hit was problematic with the company's payroll. On many occasions, payment would be delivered a few days later, but sometimes they wouldn't even get paid. Employees at Kidder wouldn't receive their payment and have to wait for next month's payment to get a double salary as compensation. Many workers reported Hit would simply disappear during these periods. Hit's behavior had turned the work environment into something truly bizarre. For months, he had been parading around galas and events like the White House Correspondents' Dinner and was seen constantly speaking about the new strategies he had in mind to take the company to the next level by taking in government funds. Hit hired 2 new employees who were tasked with turning the company into an SEC-compliant firm and started getting directly funded by the government. After only a month, both employees simply disappeared. Turns out, these 2 new employees had alerted authorities of Hit's shady dealings after he refused to show them the company books. According to the Washingtonian, the employees found that Hit had forged the company's numbers, so it appeared Kidder had $14 billion in assets, when in reality, they only had $27 million. Right after this, lawyers had stormed the office and started backing up the company's computers. Hit was charged with 8 counts of securities fraud. Once he was charged, his family came to the rescue, in their own particular way. Various family members sent a number of letters to the judge asking for a softer trial or conviction. One of his sisters, Jody Nash, stated that the amount of pressure Todd had been subjected to because of their family dynamic led him to develop mental health issues that ultimately made him act the way he did. According to her, the dynamic between her father, her brother Brett, and her brother-in-law Jim Miller pressured Todd into wanting to outperform them and do anything he could to make the family business grow. Added to this, his dramatic exit from coaching soccer and finding his way into the company wasn't an easy step. His wife stated that the way his father and brother treated him created a series of emotional issues on Hit that he would deal with on a daily basis. He was constantly underappreciated. She also went on to blame soccer for his conduct. His erratic behavior stemmed from a number of injuries he suffered while playing. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Virginia sentenced Hit to 6.5 years in prison for creating a Ponzi scheme type of scam that resulted in the loss of more than $20 million. After soliciting over $30 million from 2014 to 2018 in real estate and venture capital investments, Hit scammed most of his clients, stating he had more funds to his name than he actually did. He misinformed his clients by withholding crucial information about how their money would be used. Most of it went to fund his other multi-million-dollar project, current debts he had with former investors, and his lavish luxury lifestyle filled with private jets, tickets to games, and much more. Given his privileged lineage and the distinct reputation his family had in the DC area, Hit received substantial help. A never-before-seen restitution payment, $20 million paid in full. In addition to this payment, the Hit family agreed to pay $13.7 million in damages to compensate victims. His restitution was cause for alarm, according to prosecutors. Although he was still forced to comply with his sentence, believed it was a lower sentence partly because of his family's constant attempts for restitution. Added to that, the government stated that since he didn't directly act as an investment advisor in most of the cases, the charges were considerably lower. The only case in which he did ended up creating a $1 million loss for the parties involved, which was why the government didn't see it as a necessary measure to give a harder sentence. Hit was barred from working in investment or the securities industry, and while his time behind bars will serve as credit, he's most likely going to have to pay a further financial restitution to victims for a yet undetermined amount. Philip Bersequot used his Haitian background and his radio show to gain the trust of his Haitian listeners and then stole their money. And Tyler Tisdale stole money from his trusting clients, people such as NFL quarterbacks Carson Palmer and Matt Castle, and his own parents. Let's get right to the scammers who had everyone's trust. Philip Bersequot used his position on a popular radio show in Florida to compel the hard-working Haitian community into giving him their money for massive returns. He made promises of using investors' money in the Forex market for unbelievable returns. In his own words, he said, quote, "You give me $20,000, it's guaranteed that you'll receive 60% in a year." However, this was far from what happened. People had no idea they were falling into his scam. Investigators said that his radio show had many red flags. During his broadcast, he would continuously enforce the idea of being a member of the Haitian community. He did this solely to gain their trust, using clever phrases such as, quote, "one of you." He also made it clear that the opportunities were limited so that the listeners could take action immediately. He was smart in the fact that he not only built his trust within the Haitian community, but also created urgency among the listeners, which caused them to take action out of fear. By promising them 60% in return on investment, he scammed millions of dollars from the locals. He even went as far as to target the Haitian community at churches. His victims were simply supporting the luxurious lifestyle that he was living. There weren't any available court records for Bursaquo's charges back in 2014. However, in May 2018, he was caught in another scheme where he was preparing tax returns for other people. A federal court in Miami, Florida, permanently stopped Bursaquo's and another partner from preparing federal tax returns for other people. Authorities found that Bursaquo continually claimed education credits for taxpayers who didn't incur any qualifying expenses. The complaint also alleged that they fabricated business income or expenses for other people in order to qualify for the earned income credit. Number 4. A mirage. Michael Corta ran an investment company called Oasis International Group. And from 2011 to 2019, he simply took his investors' money, which totaled $80 million, and just spent it on his own lifestyle. According to investigators, DeCorda and his partners in crime convinced their roughly 700 victims by persuading them that they were, quote, market makers. So they were making huge margins from Forex trades because they had so much volume. They told investors that their investments would be risk-free, quote, for the most part. He also explained that Oasis was well collateralized and had plenty of backing. In reality, Oasis didn't generate any revenue at all, and all the earnings that Oasis made were just a mirage. Once he got investor money, DeCorda just went to town. For example, he bought a Maserati and a Range Rover for his family members. He also bought at least one Ferrari, 2 Benzes, and a Porsche with investor funds. And those are just the cars that the government was able to seize. He also took his family on several trips via private jet, taking them around expensive vacation spots such as Europe and the Cayman Islands. He also purchased multi-million-dollar homes in Florida. After a 13-day trial, a federal jury found DeCorda guilty for his Ponzi scheme. Even though the trial took over 13 days, it took the jury less than 4 hours of discussion to convict DeCorda of his crimes. He was also convicted of underreporting his income in 2017. He had claimed negative income for the year and got a tax refund instead. His sentencing will be happening at a later date as of the release of this video, but he faces a max of 33 years in prison. Number 3. Factored in. Former Georgia legislator Clarence Deal Alford ran a $23 million Ponzi scheme where he targeted people with ancestry or ties to India. He fooled more than 100 investors from the Indian American community into thinking they were investing in a highly lucrative business opportunity. His previous political career made him a key candidate to pull off this scam since he had a trustworthy and respectable professional history. Alford was a General Assembly member in Georgia for 5 terms, from 1983 to 1993. Alford was able to run his scam by exploiting a common finance practice that's called factoring. Basically, what factoring is where a company will sell its accounts receivable to a third party at a discount. This way, they have their cash much faster instead of having to wait for the money. Businesses will do this basically just to have cash on hand to pay the bills. Alford's scam was based on completely fake receivable invoices. He was creating fake documents, essentially fake contracts and invoices. He went as far as forging signatures of employees of the state of Georgia. He promised investors that he would use their money for energy projects, but instead, he simply paid off earlier investors. He also used investor money on unrelated projects such as a waste-to-energy project and a solar energy project. Of course, these projects weren't linked to the investors. Alford also used investor money to pay an architect for a personal multi-million-dollar home in Utah. He also bought a Tesla and used the money to pay off credit card debt. We're just wondering, if you're going to run a scam, why bother paying off your credit cards? Judge Robert F. Mumford sentenced Alford to 15 years, where he'll spend 8 years in prison and the remaining 7 years on probation. Alfred also had to pay back $8.8 million, along with interest of $1.7 million. Interestingly enough, the judgment was part of a consent agreement where Alfred neither admitted to nor denied the allegations. Did Alfred just suck so bad at running a legitimate business where it just looked like he was running a scam? Number 2. Not winning. Win Charlebois was charged with operating a Ponzi scheme where he scammed at least 75 investors out of roughly $7.1 million. He took investor funds and moved money all around where it looked like he was running a legitimate fund. But surprise, surprise, that wasn't happening. According to the SEC's complaint, Charlebois basically promised investors return on their money with multiple fake investment opportunities. These fake opportunities range from the purchase and resale of planes, the investment of a variety of private companies, and subscription agreements where funds were supposed to be used to invest in a tech company. Investigators simply found zero cash flow that was linked to any legitimate business. The only cash flow that was coming in was from investors. Most of the new money Charlebois raised from investors and obtained from loans was spent paying former investors and repaying anyone else that was supposed to get money back. Of course, the rest of the money Charlebois used on himself and his family. He used investor funds to pay off his mortgage, debt, and tuition fees for his kids. He even used the money for personal and leisure expenses, such as an exotic vacation. He didn't shy away from spending investor money. He took his family on a ski trip to Beaver Creek, Colorado in January 2021, a 4-day excursion that cost him around $9,100. They stayed at the Ritz and had expenses that included roughly $1,800 for ski access and rentals, and also $1,200 for limo service for the 4-day vacation. In March 2021, Charlebois and his family traveled to Boca Grande, Florida for a week-long vacation. The family splashed around roughly $9,000 again, despite having a negative balance in their joint checking account. Clearly, his spending habits were relentless. The SEC is still seeking to stop Win Charlebois with an asset freeze, as well as making him repay his investors plus interest and civil penalties. Number 1. Serial scamming. Tyler Tisdale was able to con more than $46 million from 77 investors, which included former NFL quarterbacks Carson Palmer and Matt Castle, through his management fund, Cobalt Sports Capital. Tisdale's immediate family, including his parents-in-laws, lost a total of $4 million investing with his fund. Tisdale advertised his company on having access to exclusive deals and running their own successful businesses. However, they only made small loans to entertainers and athletes, and these loans were almost scams in and of themselves, as they were handed out at exorbitant interest rates. According to the DA's office, Tisdale and his business partner, Grant Carter, sold investors on the idea of making massive returns with very little risk. They also completely lied about the business opportunities they had. For example, Tisdale made false claims that his management company was valued at $15 million. He also said that the company's private label wine business, Curious Cork Import LLC, alone was going to be worth $25 million soon. They told investors that they could expect to see 10 to 15 times their investment. Instead, the 3 investors he and Grant pitched that deal to lost a total of $500,000. For that little stunt, they were actually charged back in 2020, and as part of their plea deal, they paid back the $500,000 to those investors. In court, Tisdale's attorney argued that Tisdale shouldn't go to prison because he didn't, quote, line his with the investors' money. He argued that he invested their money in legitimate companies. The only thing he wasn't clear on was being dishonest with investors about where that money was going. And, that little thing about the risk of the investments. His lawyer, Fred Winokur, argued that Tisdale wasn't a Ponzi schemer and that he believed in the companies he advertised. He also tried to convince the jury that Tisdale was doing what was in the best interest of his investors and lenders. He also pointed out that his own parents and immediate family lost their money too investing with Tisdale, and would he scam his own family? Winokur argued that Tisdale had the best of intentions, but he simply was in over his head. He was blinded by his pride and his desire to maintain his reputation. However, prosecutor I.L. Shamsuddin pointed out that Tisdale used money from new investors to pay old investors. We all know what exactly that means. He argued that Tisdale knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew what he was doing was wrong. He also asked that Tisdale be sentenced to 6 years in prison. Tyler Tisdale pleaded guilty in June of 2021, and prosecutor Shamsuddin got his wish. Tisdale was sentenced to 6 years in prison, as well as having to pay back more than $18 million in restitution. What's the sadder scam here? This Brazilian girl scammed her own mom for over $100 million, while this guy flipped out and decided to rob a corner store after losing his life savings to crypto. Let's get right to it. Number 5. Wedding hostage. UK man Lewis Crosby had it all. He was a cornerstone member of his community and was set to marry a girl from Singapore that he had met online. So, what could have gone wrong? He threw his life savings, including the money for an agreed dowry and even his rent, into a cryptocurrency scam back in November of 2021. After losing everything, Crosby snapped. About an hour after it all went down, he formulated a drastic plan. The man picked up his air pistol, every bit as illegal to use in a crime as a real pistol, and headed to his local premier shop. Crosby walked in, rocking a hood, shades, and a scarf, and proceeded to the counter. He took out the air pistol, which looked just like the real deal, and pointed it between the counter and the clear barrier directly at one of the clerks. He demanded all the money they could give him. Under normal circumstances, this story may have been a bit longer. There may have been an escape and a period as a fugitive involved. After all, a lot of retail employees, when staring down a barrel, will gladly give away their employer's money. The two on duty at Premier that day in November, however, weren't having any of it. The pair went on the offensive. Even without the knowledge that they weren't up against a real gunman, they approached and subdued Crosby. One of the terrified employees gathered their nerves and marched right up to the shooter. The dude actually grabbed the gun and got it away from Crosby, then put him on the ground and held him there. There were, of course, a million ways this could have gone seriously wrong. One of the workers even grabbed a sharp, broken-off broomstick just in case. The situation could have gotten very out of hand very quickly, but the shopkeepers simply kept Crosby in check until the police arrived. When the case hit Newcastle Crown Court, Judge Julie Clementson didn't believe she was looking at a career criminal. Instead, what she saw was a man who regularly made a positive impact in his community. Everybody involved in the case agreed that Crosby was a wreck. As if the emotional roller coaster of losing his life savings wasn't enough, his desperation made him think it was a good idea to commit a serious crime. To say the man was in shambles would be an understatement. The court ended up handing down a suspended 2-year sentence. Essentially, Crosby was put on probation. He's been given rehabilitation and community service stipulations and can avoid jail time by following them. Obviously, if he commits a crime during this period, he'll end up serving his original sentence. His bride-to-be and her family were surprisingly forgiving. As of this writing, the wedding is still on, with no date set just yet. Given there was a dowry involved, Crosby will have to make that back and get his life on track before he can hope to open a new chapter with a partner. Number 4. Involuntary scamming. Kay Ferguson, a financial manager from Australia, fell victim to 2 scams back-to-back. And then she was manipulated into doing some scamming of her own. She gave out some of her own money to scammers, but she's no ordinary victim. Around $1.1 million was scammed from her employer, Moala Water Ski Club. It's one of the sad truths of the internet that older folks and those looking for love can be gullible, and she was both. After separating from her husband in 2020, Ferguson began using a 50 and up online dating service, aptly named Singles 50s, where she ran into not one, but 2 troublesome men. Between the 2 of them, she cleaned out her personal bank accounts and stole from work no less than 27 times between December of 2020 and January of 2021. It all started when Ferguson met an unidentified man on the service who decided she was ripe for blackmail. He hit her with one of the oldest tricks in the book. He used her own lust against her. After convincing her to send him explicit images, he demanded that she pay him $130,000 to avoid those images making their way to her children. You would think she'd cut her losses at that point and hop off the dating service, or at least wisen up. But You'd be wrong. A second man, using the false name William David Rodovan, was next in line. He ran a scam on Ferguson that was a bit more innocent, but much more effective. Claiming to be an engineer, he had her call him at work. During their chat, there was a loud noise and he suddenly hung up. The next time the pair talked, this catfish told his victim that there had been an explosion and some of his workers were dead. With his quote-unquote business in ruins, he didn't have the funds to pay out severance and other costs to the families of the deceased. This is where Ferguson comes in. After handing over about $225,000 from her own pocket, Ferguson was broke. The scammer, formerly known as Rodovan, however, wasn't done yanking on her heartstrings. He said he needed even more money, and Ferguson didn't disappoint. She used her position as financial officer to transfer money from her employer's business account to offshore accounts held by the scammer. Investigators and court officials would later prove that Ferguson dipped into the company's accounts at least 27 times. But it's highly likely she did it many more times than they can pin on her. The icing on the cake here? One of those illegitimate transfers was about $40,000, which Ferguson sent to herself to pay contractors for work on her house. In a show of instant karma, the house wound up being sold to pay back her employer. Ferguson's crime spree lasted a month or so before the water ski club's owner noticed something was amiss. He asked the police for help with finding the discrepancy in his finances. It didn't take investigators very long to figure out what was going on. Ferguson didn't do much to cover her tracks. Had they not figured it out, she likely would have continued sending money. After being caught in January and tried in March, Ferguson ultimately entered a guilty plea. Her people were reluctant to put all the details out there right away, but changed their tune when the judge threatened to reject the plea. In June of 2022, the courts decided on a 3-year sentence of intensive corrections to be served in Ferguson's community. Millwalla Water Ski Club CEO Peter Duncan said he was disappointed about how it all went down, but he's not mad at Ferguson. In the end, she was just another sucker. Number 3. Elderly twist. A scammer out of New York by the name of Stephen Pagertanis caught a harsh 15-year sentence for his crimes. But that's actually less than the length of time he ran his grand scam. Formerly a financial advisor, Pagertanis used his knowledge and position to steal some $9 million from elderly investors over the course of 18 years. He ran the grift from 2000 to 2018 and mostly targeted the elderly, a detail that the courts dug into in his sentencing. Pagertanis was most recently working with Lombard Securities Incorporated, a network of independent stockbrokers with its HQ in Maryland. His relationship was more affiliate than employee, allowing him flexibility with little oversight. Naturally, his license to be a financial advisor and stockbroker was revoked when the case broke, and he confessed. The scam was a simple Ponzi scheme on the surface, but Pagertanis was more qualified than anybody to run it. Already a legitimate and well-versed investment broker, he had no problem luring victims in, falsifying documents, and balancing out payouts with his take from the top. He was able to run the scam completely on his own for a staggering 18 years only because of this knowledge and skill set. The cycle would begin with an unsuspecting victim offered an investment opportunity. Pagertanis would promise investors that their principal was safe, a bold move in any investment vehicle that should have raised a red flag. Those that didn't see through the ruse were promised a fixed return, usually between 4 and 8% per year. That ROI doesn't sound like much, but it's a substantial buffer to savings and a higher rate than many legitimate investments. Once the investors were on board, they would wire money directly to an entity that was secretly controlled by Pagertanis. He would pass that money through a number of external accounts and entities to launder it. Once the money was sufficiently hard to trace, Pagertanis would send some off the top to his own account. He would also render promised payouts to investors who had been on board longer. Along the way, he would falsify documents, account statements, and other paperwork showing ownership, interest in investments, and other pertinent info. The victims of his scam were spread across the nation. Of some $13 million invested, clients lost around $9 million in all. Janice Gukwa from Florida reportedly lost $250,000. Hope Dragon from Tiny Patchogue couldn't attend the hearing due to health issues stemming from the sheer stress of the financial losses she suffered. Instead, her children, Nicole Gensel and Ron Hulson, attended. 2 more victims lost $3 million and $2.5 million. This case takes an interesting turn at the court phase. While most scammers would simply face criminal charges from the feds, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission filed a civil suit. He's essentially been barred from having anything to do with the investment world. A judgment was also passed down that ordered him to pay over $6 million to his victims. Even with the $5 million he paid back into the scam over the time he ran it, this would still leave victims short by about $2 to $3 million. Stephen Pagertanis was 59 when he was caught, which means he started the scam at age 41. Unless time gets cut off, he's going to be getting out of prison when he's 74. He was handed a 15-year sentence along with 3 years of supervised release afterwards. Number 2. Senior targeting. Christopher Dougherty, an investment planner out of San Diego, pulled off a $6 million Ponzi scheme. The man targeted the most vulnerable in society, being affluent, elderly folk. Like most Ponzi schemes, this one fell apart when the money ran out at the top, meaning the scammer was unable to continue paying new investors. The way it all unraveled, though, wasn't like most Ponzi schemes, where your average scammer may try to just disappear when it all comes crashing down. This guy filed for bankruptcy. He racked up debt through illegal actions, then tried to go through official courts to have it dispelled. Dougherty filed for bankruptcy in 2018 and got busted in 2019. Had he not made that filing, he may have been able to get more suckers on board and continue the scam. This wasn't even his first run-in with the law. He got caught stealing from a youth baseball league back in 2011, making this second offense that much worse. Dougherty's laser focus on rich elderly folk was a sticking point for the scam. This particular type of sucker, usually very gullible and with lots of savings at their command, reportedly made up a bit more than half of his victims. He would mainly target those looking to grow and diversify their retirement savings to live their twilight years a bit better or leave a nest egg for future generations. The scam at its surface is pretty simple. For most victims, Dougherty started them off with safe, traditional investments. This would be a decent way to run a Ponzi scheme if you decided to do one, but he wanted more. He came up with bold and unconventional investment vehicles to grab more victims' attention. Naturally, they were all fake. Most of his investments outside of the traditional realm centered around businesses that he purported to own or farmland that he supposedly owned and would eventually be pulling a profit from. In some of these cases, he scammed more than just the investors. One couple living on a farm he may or may not have owned had their power cut at one point because they thought that Dougherty would be footing the bill. Sharon and David Vega were two of Dougherty's most prominent victims and were instrumental in bringing the whole thing down. The business relationship started some 17 years ago, and they didn't suspect a thing until the payouts dried up. Interestingly, the scamming for these two didn't start until a few years ago, which means Dougherty didn't try to scam two of his most prominent customers until he was already seeing some measure of success. When Dougherty did begin defrauding two of his most prominent customers, it started innocent enough. He instructed them to take some money out of one investment vehicle that they had together and put it somewhere else. Specifically, he wanted them to put something into private placement for some unnamed farm subsidy accounts. They did what he asked to the tune of about $30,000. Before too long, checks to the Vegas began bouncing. David always seemed to have an excuse at the ready, but Sharon and David were having none of it. They eventually went to the authorities and the media, kicking off the investigation that would ultimately spell an end to Dougherty's big scam. The investigation even uncovered other victims, at least two of whom were knocked financially flat by the scam. Jerry and Diane, who declined to use their last names in the reports, were left relying on their children to survive. Dougherty's scam put him high on the hog for many years. Before it all came tumbling down, he was using the ill-gotten gains for home renovation, travel, and college tuition, among other expenses. The fake investments he offered to clients were all eventually found to be just that, fake. In July of 2020, the story finally met its conclusion. Filing for bankruptcy in 2018 and catching charges in 2019, Dougherty pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. All told, his victims only got back about $3 million of the over $10 million that he took, leaving them collectively $7 million down. Number 1. Mom Scam. Brazilian Sabine Cole Bogici was arrested for scamming her own mother out of somewhere around 724 million real, the equivalent of just over $142 million. She ran the scam for 2 years and managed to get money, valuable paintings, and other goods out of the deal. Sabine didn't act alone. Diana Rosa, Aparecida Stanesco Vuletek, and Slavko Vuletek, along with 4 other unnamed parties, were also brought in as part of the scam, according to official records. Together, they started out by simply tricking Sabine's 82-year-old mom, Genevieve Bogici, into handing over valuables. Before too long, though, things started started to escalate. They continued pressuring the woman to wring more money and valuables from her. Eventually, the operation took a sinister turn before she finally had enough and went to the cops. Genevieve endured being physically threatened, intimidated, and even isolated by her own daughter. The scam began when Sabine set her sights on Tarsila do Amaral's celebrated painting Sol Poente. Genevieve's late husband, Jean Bogici, was an art collector and left her a great deal of valuable art when he passed away. Sol Poente and 2 other pieces by the same artist fell into the hands of Sabine and her associates, worth around 700 million real together. Sol Poente, in particular, had even had a stint in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Tarsila do Amaral is thought of by some as the mother of Brazilian modern art, having produced 7 widely hailed works of art around the 1920s. 3 of these, all originals, were scooped up by Jean Bogici and later taken by Sabine and her crew. The other 2 paintings were Osono and Pont-Neuf, and the 3 together formed the bulk of the gain from the scam. Sabine wouldn't have been able to pull this off on her own. The first step in the scam was to bring associates on board who would fill key roles in throwing Genevieve off guard. Chief among these were psychics. The first so-called psychic to approach Genevieve did so out of the blue and rocked her world with the grim premonition that her daughter would soon die. Sabine kept feeding this psychic and others personal information that was used to scare and coerce Genevieve. As the scam progressed, the psychics not only took fees from Genevieve, they convinced her to part with valuables. The first thing on the list was Sol Poente. The team worked on the beleaguered mum to make her believe that the painting was cursed and tied to her daughter's upcoming demise. Under the guise of praying for and purifying the objects, the psychics convinced Genevieve to let them haul the paintings away. Amaral wasn't the only indirect victim here. Influential artwork from a number of Brazilian masters was also involved in the heist. The works of Rubens Gertman, Cicero Dias, and Alberto Guignard were stolen, among many others. All told, at least 16 paintings went missing. Authorities wasted no time once they were brought into the picture. Investigation proceedings, including tracking the paintings, began immediately. In August of 2022, police began executing warrants, making arrests. Along with Sabine herself, authorities have nabbed 4 other suspects as of this writing. As for recovering the paintings, many were found in the homes of suspects during raids. Others have made their way to brokers and galleries. Of the 16 confirmed missing, 11 are officially back in the hands of their rightful owner. Click to watch one of these next videos. Let us know in the comments section what you would pick. Be 25 with 0 net worth knowing what you know today, or would you rather be 65 with $30 million net worth?